Do you want to go back to the days of military weakness, caring more about criminals than victims? We can't risk that. I'd like your vote on Tuesday.
Leadership that's on your side. Michael Dukakis for president.
In the midst of the presidential campaign, an ad was released about a person by the name of Willie Horton.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton.
This became a focal point of an entire presidential campaign.
Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Dukakis had protected the program, vetoed an effort to repeal it, and that he favored letting murderers out on the weekend.
That Dukakis had a double-digit lead over Bush before the campaign focused on Willie Horton, and after that, Bush overtook Dukakis and won the election.
Which candidate for president can you really count on to be tough on crime? George Bush.
Bush won the election by creating fear around black men as criminal without saying that's what he was doing.
A very racially
sounds familiar.
Divisive moment.
Sounds like when Trump said that all Mexicans were rapists.
On the part of that campaign. There's no one who can tell me otherwise.
Liberals calling Willie Horton to make it sound like you're being dismissive. The original article was Reader's Digest. William Horton, no picture. The Democrats that want you to know he's black.
Thanks, bro. It was not his name. It was his image that was sensationalized.
Liberals that announced that it was mean to pick on a murderer and a rapist lose all credibility on this discussion. They just lose it. And people go, we don't want to hear anything else you have to say about crime.
No matter what anybody says, what anybody does, they know exactly what button they were trying to hit with that ad.
Stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend.
It went to a kind of primitive fear, a primitive American fear, because Willie Horton was metaphorically the black male rapist that had been a staple of the white imagination since the time just after slavery.
Here was a black man convicted of rape. I will be the savior and protector of the white population, never minding the fact that the history of interracial rape in this country, that record is far more marked by white rape against black women than of black men against white women.
Sorry, graphic. Trigger warning.
This idea that had such great artistic utility in 1915 in Birth of a Nation still had a great deal of political utility almost at the end of that century.
The way that we appeal to voters' sense of fear and anxiety in our nation runs through black bodies.
Also 9/11 with all the terrorists. Interesting.
Khadija pops is locked, she wanna pop the lock. My prison ain't nothing but a private stock. And she be dreaming about his day to release. She hate the police, but loved by her grandma who hugs and kisses her. Her father's a political prisoner, free Fred, son of a panther that the government shot dead. Behind enemy lines, my niggas are cellmates. Most of the youth never escape the jail fate. Super maximum camps will advance their game plan to keep us in the hands of the man locked up.
They're a new generation of Democrats, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and they don't think the way the old Democratic Party did. They've sent a strong signal to criminals by supporting the death penalty.
Looking at the way in which Democrats were defeated in 1988, that they were defeated in 1984, that they were defeated in 1980, there comes to be a sentiment among the Democrats that they have to adopt a position that is much more kind of centrist.
It became virtually impossible for a politician to run and appear soft on crime.
I was not for the bill that he was talking about because it was not tough enough on the criminal.
You know, when you're in an environment where everybody's trying to do the same thing, everybody's competing to be tough on crime, you quickly all end up in the same space, so it doesn't become a political advantage unless you do something more.
We need more police on the street. There is a crime bill which would put more police on the street, which was killed for this session by a filibuster in the Senate, mostly by Republican senators.
We had consistently had squishy, soft, liberal won't protect you, tough conservative will protect you. We won that fight every time. And by the late 80s, early 90s, people like Bill Clinton had begun to figure out they had to be able to match us.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Bill Clinton is trying to figure out how he can deal with a country that's still basically Reagan's country, but he's trying to govern as a Democrat.
Violent crime and the fear it provokes are crippling our society.
Then some high-profile, very horrendous crimes take place.
Residents pulled together in the search for 12-year-old Polly Klaas. They're now coping with the discovery of her body over the weekend.
Polly Klaas abducted from her bedroom at home and ultimately killed, which led to the California 3 strikes and you're outlaw.
When you commit a third violent crime, you will be put away and put away for good. 3 strikes and you are out.
A person is convicted of their third felony. Essentially, that person is mandated to prison for the rest of their lives.
So many third strike defendants awaiting trial, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department is forced to release 4,200 misdemeanor inmates every month to make room for incoming 3-strike prisoners.
And it's in line with many of the other policies we've created, particularly mandatory minimums.
Mandatory sentencing. We said we were no longer going to let judges consider the circumstances around a crime. We're just going to impose a mandatory sentence.
And that's a difficult thing for judges because they are trying to dispense justice on a daily basis and are unable to do so.
In many California communities, all civil trials have been canceled to catch up with the criminal case workload.
We've taken discretion away from judges, arguably the most neutral party in the court, and given it over to prosecutors.
95% of the elected prosecutors throughout the United States are white.
Serious, violent criminals serve at least 85% of their sentence.
We passed a truth in sentencing law that kept people in prison for 85% of their sentence.
Truth in sentencing. The idea is you're sentenced to a certain amount of time. The public wants to be confident that you're going to do just about every bit of that time.
We've done away with parole. So when you get, in the federal system, when you get 20 years or 30 years, that's what you got.
We had parole in this country as a mechanism for getting people out of jails and prisons when it was clear that they were no longer a threat to public safety.
Sharonda has spent the last 16 years in prison, and she'll die there because she was sentenced to life without parole. Her only crime, transporting cocaine. And when I say only crime, I mean only crime. She had no other arrests, none. If the judge was required to send Sharonda away for life.
Longer sentences,
for
3
life
strikes
for
and you're
that?
out. Almost 60 new capital punishment offenses.
And then comes to Congress with a proposal for a $30 billion federal crime bill of 1994 that was heavily loaded towards law enforcement incarceration.
I propose a 21st century crime bill to deploy the latest technologies and tactics to make our communities even safer.
That omnibus crime bill was responsible for a massive expansion of the prison system. And beyond that, it provided all kinds of money in perverse incentives for law enforcement to do a lot of the things that we nowadays consider to be abusive.
It will be used to build prisons to keep 100,000 violent criminals off the street.
Not only does he increase funding to states to build prisons, to lock up as many people involved in drug crimes, but also to put 100,000 police officers on the street.
Crime has been a hot political issue, used too often to divide us.
What President Clinton did in 1994 is actually far more
This helps you watch this kind of
because he
angry,
built that infrastructure that we see today, the
enticing thing with some nice painting so you can relax.
Police departments that have SWAT teams.
And again, we see this kind of notching up.
Excuse me.
Being arrested at every level and this kind of exploding prison population.
We are a nation that professes freedom, yet we have this mass incarceration, this hyper incarceration that is trawling into it, grinding into it, our most vulnerable citizenry, and is overwhelmingly biased towards people of color.
say a few words
10
about
years,
it.
$1 million.
Because I signed a bill that made the problem worse. And I want to admit it.
His 1994 crime bill, something that he now admits was a mistake.
There were longer sentences. And most of these people are in prison under state law, but the federal law set a trend. And that was overdone. We were wrong about that.
Well, I think it's important that President Clinton acknowledges that things didn't turn out exactly as he and all of us would have wished.
I'm happy that he realizes the error of his ways. I think he knew back then that it wasn't good policy, I'll be honest.
Back then, there was an outcry over the rising crime rate, and people from all communities were asking that action be taken. Now, my husband said at the NAACP last summer that it solved some problems, but it created other problems, and I agree.
I'm glad to see that he is apologetic, but I think he has to take responsibility and accountability for that, and so does Hillary, because she supported it then and up until recently.
Bill Clinton faced off against a group of Black Lives Matter protesters protesting a 1994 crime bill that they say led to a surge in the imprisonment of black people.
I don't know how you would characterize the gang leaders who got 13-year-old kids hopped up on crack and sent them out onto the street to murder other African-American children. Maybe you thought they were good citizens. She didn't. She didn't. You are defending the people who kill the lives you say matter. Tell the truth.
We can't ignore the reality of force here. The policies that Bill Clinton put forward, mandatory minimums, 3 strikes, those were a use of political force. They forced millions of people who would not otherwise be in prison today into prison. They forced families to be broken. They forced children to live without their parents. That's what happened.
Why? We shouldn't ask, why is Bill Clinton so strong? We should ask, why is the black community so weak in our inability to defend ourselves? Let's not forget how many
yes, I like how that turned out.
In the 60s and 70s. Let's not forget how many of our leaders are are in prison. You've stripped out a whole generation of leadership. You ran them out of the country, you put them in prison, you put them in cemeteries. And then you unleash this blitzkrieg. And we don't have the ability to defend ourselves. You can tell the story of white leadership in America and never mention the FBI one time. You can't tell the story of black leadership, not one, without having to deal with the full weight of the criminal justice system weaponized against black dissent.
I'm tired of living every day under the threat of death. I have no martyr complex. I want to live as long as anybody in this building tonight.
Dr. King, people forget, was not this beloved figure that everybody wants to put on a pedestal. He was considered one of the most dangerous people in America by the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Don't tell me that Dr. King has no relevance to the young brothers in the street. They deal with little bitty cops. He was dealing with the top cop.
We were brought here against our will. We were not brought here to be made citizens. We were not brought here to enjoy the constitutional gifts that they speak so beautifully about.
Malcolm's whole entourage was infiltrated with police. He may have had as many police in his entourage as he had regular folk in his entourage, undercover, so afraid of black dissent.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover today asserted that the Black Panthers represent the greatest internal threat to the nation.
J. Edgar Hoover said, these Panthers represent the greatest threat to American democracy at the time.
Oh. They did not.
Never were that big. I mean, no one in their right mind could ever believe that the Black Panthers were going to bring down the greatest military force in the history of the world. The whole movement was criminalized and destroyed systematically by the government.
I think people haven't thought about what it means to lose with Fred Hampton, who somehow was able to pull together blacks and whites and Puerto Ricans and Native Americans to fight for justice at 21.
We're going to defend justice, not the I'm locked up, not everybody's locked up. That you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution.
He had to go.
The head of the Black Panthers in Illinois was killed today by police in Chicago. Illinois Panther Chairman Fred Hampton and another Panther leader from Peoria, Illinois, were killed.
This is where our chairman had his brains blown out. He lay in his bed, sleeping at 4:30 in the morning.
They literally went and shot his whole house up with his pregnant wife next to him in the bed. So afraid of a leader that could unite people.
We know the history of folks who've done this kind of standing up to these systems, and we know how the system has murdered them, assassinated them, exiled them, excluded them, or found ways to discredit them.
Assata Shakur was one of the great leaders of the Black Liberation Army.
That order given by J. Edgar Hoover was essentially to destroy any black, progressive, third world movement in this country.
They put her in prison, and her allies said, we're not going to leave her in prison. She had white allies that said, we're not going to leave her in prison, and pulled her out of prison and got her to Cuba. She's in Cuba right now.
In the next 5 years, something like 300 prisons are in the planning stages, and this government has the intentions of throwing more and more people in prison.
The criminalization of Assata Shakur, the use of the media to represent her as a dangerous criminal, and of course in my own case, where I was represented by the FBI as being armed and dangerous.
The FBI has put black militant Angela Davis on its list of the 10 most wanted fugitives.
With Angela Davis, the power of the black intellect.
One of the things that we really have to talk about coming to grips with is the whole question of crime. What does it mean to be a criminal in this society?
That had to be broken up.
And in my case, Ronald Reagan was the governor of California. Richard Nixon was the president of the U.S. The whole apparatus of the state was set up against me. They really meant to send me to the death chamber in order to make a point.
The actions of the FBI in apprehending Angela Davis, a rather remarkable story again.
The system tried to put the sister on trial, and the sister said, no, we put you on trial. Comes in the big afro, she didn't go press her hair. She was facing major time. Most people, they'd got a nice little press, you know what I mean? They'd have been there with little white gloves on praying to Jesus. She came in like this.
Hell yeah.
And she devastated the prosecution and walked out of there free.
Hi, Josh.
But the question is, Monica, how did you get there? Did you get there by confrontation, violence?
Oh, was that the question you were asking?
Yeah.
So I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. After the 4 young girls who lived, one of them lived next door to me. I was very good friends with the sister of another one. My sister was very good friends with all 3 of them. My mother taught one of them in her class, and they went down, and what did they find? They found limbs and heads strewn all over the place. I remember from the time I was very small, I remember the sounds of bombs exploding across the street, our house shaking. I remember my father having to have guns at his disposal at all times because of the fact that at any moment someone, we might expect to be attacked. I mean, that's why when someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible. Because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what black people have gone through, what black people have experienced in this country since the time the first black person was kidnapped from the shores of Africa.
Why they gotta go close up on her face like that, though?
Running folk out the country,
Really
killing
powerful
folk,
statement.
framing folk. You will be vulnerable to Bill Clinton or anybody else. They'll do to you what they will.
That's so fucked up. Here we go.
There's a man going round taking names. He It left my heart in pain. There's a man going round taking names. Going round.
An armed neighborhood watch leader saw Martin walking inside a gated subdivision near Orlando. He thought the 17-year-old looked suspicious.
He's got his hand in his waistband. Yeah, he's a black male. These assholes, they always get away. Are you following him? Yeah. Okay, we don't need you to do that.
So you think he's yelling help?
Yes.
Alright, what is your number?
Tonight, a deadly shooting in Sanford. Police have the gun, they've got the shooter, but they have not arrested him.
George Zimmerman, armed with a gun, followed this quote-unquote suspicious kid after the dispatchers told him not to. They ended up on the ground in a fight, and George Zimmerman shot and killed Trayvon Martin. The police could not arrest Zimmerman because of this Florida law called Stand Your Ground, which says you can kill someone if you feel threatened, even though it was Zimmerman who had pursued Martin throughout the neighborhood with a gun.
Mr. Zimmerman felt that he, in self-defense, needed to fire his weapon.
Not only was he not arrested after the killing, but in court, Zimmerman actually pleaded self-defense and got off under the Stand Your Ground law.
We, the jury, find George Zimmerman not guilty.
What the fuck?
The Stand Your Ground law that was passed in Florida played a huge role in the Trayvon Martin tragedy, and this really ignited the movement that we see today.
On the eve of Trayvon Martin's death, Florida's Stand Your Ground law came into the spotlight.
How did this law not only get in place in Florida, but around the country? And all the fingers kept pointing back to Alec.
Alex sounds like the name
of a high school lacrosse player who just got baked and wrecked his dad's Saab. But incredibly, it's actually even worse.
Alec is a political lobbying group.
Alec is a political lobbying group.
They write laws. And give them to Republicans. Stand Your Ground was written by Alec.
Alec is this private club, and its members are politicians and corporations. But the real question is, should politicians and corporations be in the same private club? Under the umbrella of Alec, corporate members get to propose laws to their political counterparts, most of whom are Republicans. So through Alec, corporations have a huge say in our lawmaking. And at Alec task force meetings, corporate lobbyists secretly vote as equals with lawmakers on bills that those lawmakers then introduce to become laws in our states.
What the fuck?
Alec is everywhere. Roughly 1 in 4 state legislators are members.
And I am proud to stand
Bye,
with Alec.
bye,
And
Jack.
it's not hard to see why. Alec makes their jobs troublingly easy. Here's their model electricity freedom
Love you too.
which at one point says, "Be it therefore enacted that the state of insert state repeals the renewable energy mandate." So as long as you can remember and spell the name of your state, you can introduce legislation.
We've also seen Alec bills introduced where a lawmaker forgot to take the Alec letterhead off the bill without remembering to take off the Alec letterhead to try to distance the real role of Alec and Alec corporations from those bills.
I'm just curious, does the legislation have some connection to Alec?
Representative Atkins, I'm not sure why we're pursuing this course of questioning. This bill is my bill. It's not Alec's bill.
The reason I ask is because earlier you passed out a handout that says Gottwald at the top, and it says Healthcare Compact, and there's a logo right in the middle of that page. And I went to the Alec website, and there's exactly the same font, the same size. And the same
Damn, you fucking caught, bitch.
Verbatim.
Well, it's totally shocking to know that Alec has been around for more than 4 decades now. And it's even more startling to see how it began.
Alec has forged a unique partnership between state legislators and leaders from the corporate and business community.
Corporations have been influencing laws for decades now through Alec.
They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. As a matter of
a fact our leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Nearly every ALEC bill benefits one of its corporate funders. The corporation Walmart was a long-standing member of ALEC at the time that it adopted the so-called Stand Your Ground law. It's a law that created an atmosphere where gun sales boomed. Walmart is the biggest seller of long guns in the U.S., has been the largest retailer of bullets in the world. So it's reasonable to think that Walmart benefited from these Stand Your Ground laws that ALEC pushed that initially prevented the arrest of the killer of Trayvon Martin and was designed to prevent the arrest, prosecution, and conviction of the killer of Trayvon Martin, including through changing the jury instructions to require that a jury be told that someone like George Zimmerman has a right to stand his ground, but not that someone like Trayvon Martin has a right to stand his ground against someone like George Zimmerman with a gun assailing him. After the outcry over Stand Your Ground and the Trayvon Martin tragedy, Walmart stepped out of ALEC. It left ALEC, abandoned ALEC. But the Walmart family continues to fund ALEC. Other corporations followed suit and stepped away from ALEC, but many corporations are still members, including Koch Industries, State Farm Insurance, Pharma, which is the lobbying group for the pharmaceutical industry. ALEC has been supported by the tobacco industry, as well as AT&T and Verizon. And for nearly 2 decades, one of those corporations was Corrections Corporation of America.
Every day we serve our communities, from small towns to large cities at more than 60 locations across our country. As the nation's 5th largest correctional system, we build, own, and manage secure correctional facilities.
CCA was the first private prison corporation in the U.S. It started as a small company in Tennessee in 1983.
These folks started making contracts with states, and they had to protect their investment, so the states were required to keep these prisons filled, even if nobody was committing a crime. And in the late 80s and early 90s, this became a growth industry, unlike very few growth industries in America's history. It was absolutely a model guaranteed to succeed.
And one of the ways we see that is through the role of CCA within ALEC to advance a series of bills.
All the legislation you could think of that we fight so hard against. 3 strikes, you're out.
3 strikes and you are out.
Mandatory minimum sentencing laws.
Serve at least 85% of their sentence.
We're the ones that were putting out there, like on a premier prefix dinner menu, a steady influx of bodies to generate the profit that would go to the shareholders.
Through ALEC, CCA became the leader in private prisons. It's a multi-billion-dollar business today that gets rich off punishment.
We are America's leader in partnership corrections. We are CCA.
And so through ALEC, CCA had a hand in shaping crime policy across the country, including not just prison privatization, but the rapid increase in criminalization.
I think this accusation that quite frankly is just false, that somehow ALEC was in favor of imprisoning a bunch of people for because of private prisons. I think that's just unfortunately one of these attack type tactics they do on ALEC.
ALEC pushed forward a number of policies to increase the number of people in prison and to increase the sentences of people who are in prison.
I'm trying to think how to address it. It's hard to address something that's like basically almost like folklore at this point.
They are not doing anything to really clean up that past or to address the real consequences for real people of the extreme policies they push. In fact, it doesn't even talk about its past history.
I mean, it's hard for me to even understand what they're even talking about. A lot of
CCA directly profited from its investment in ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and the American people in many ways were harmed by these policies due to the mass incarceration of people, particularly people of color.
Look, right now our position is that we want less people in prison. I don't think that helps the private prison industry, quite frankly. I think myself and the lawmakers, we're just always looking for better,
helps the private. We don't want people in prison.
Conservatives, those who believe in the free market and limited government, we pride ourselves on. We're supposed to be the party of innovation.
What the fuck? So y'all want to keep that because you're making money? So fucking
CCA was on the ALEC task force that pushed that law that gave police the right to stop anyone they thought looked like an immigrant.
Oh, I'm getting hot.
This law filled immigration detention facilities, and it directly benefited an ALEC member, CCA.
CCA could potentially reap huge financial benefits from SB 1070, since 1070 was designed to lock up a lot more people in Arizona on federal immigration charges. Cha-ching!
An influx of undocumented immigrants, many of them children, has crammed...
In Arizona, Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, holds the federal contract to house detained immigrants. It's worth more than $11 million every month.
Our immigration facilities are a disgrace. Their families kept there in horrible conditions.
They're called detention facilities, but they're really prisons for immigrants. So you call them a detention facility doesn't make them not a prison. They are a prison, they just have a different name.
We're having what some people are saying is a creation of a crimmigration system, that there's the merger of our immigration enforcement and our law enforcement system. And so that some of the same things that were used in the war on drugs are now migrating to other populations.
You heard it with Donald Trump, not about blacks, but with Mexicans. You know, oh, well, they're rapists, murderers. Oh, and by the way, some of them may be good people. Oh, boy, you know, where do you start on something like that?
In late 2010, CCA left ALEC after a big NPR story came out accusing ALEC of pushing SB 1070.
ALEC doesn't do anything on immigration. No which way, not to the right, not to the left, nothing. So I don't really have anything for you on that one, sorry.
ALEC has recently made what I would describe as a PR move to say that it's going to be right on crime, that it's going to be on the right side of criminal justice policy and reform. That move comes in the wake of its loss of a massive number of corporations.
What ultimately happened is our board looked at the issues that ALEC worked on and decided that we don't do social issues. We were focused on economic issues. We jettisoned basically almost all of our legislation that was pre-2007. So we basically fresh slate going forward, fresh start going forward.
This industry knows that it's dying and is actually preparing for the next thing. And the animating factors that have led to a system like bail, we're always going to see new permutations of a cancer, right? And that's what this is.
And over the last couple of years, since 2008, we've been involved really in a wholesale reform effort where 31 states have now adopted positive changes on sentencing, on parole and probation reforms.
ALEC has a concerted effort to privatize almost every aspect of government, but we had no idea that they were also aiming to try to privatize probation and parole. ALEC is no longer concerned about CCA and CCA's interests. CCA no longer has a seat at the table with ALEC, so it doesn't have a financial interest in advancing policies that increase the profits of CCA. But the American Bail Coalition is still part of ALEC.
Today, our state penitentiaries are filled to the brim and overflowing with inmates.
When I think of systems of oppression, historically in this country and elsewhere, they're durable and they